Hi everyone, and welcome to this Bristol Ideas Festival discussion on modernism. We're going to be focusing on the sort of modernist era in 1922 and the 100th anniversary of some of the key modernist texts. My name is Sian Norris, and I'm the Chief European and Social Affairs Reporter at Byline Times. I'm also the founder of the Bristol Women's Literature Festival and a big modernism enthusiast. Before I introduce our amazing panel, I would encourage you to please sign up to our newsletter and to follow us on social media, and then you'll be able to find out about more events like this. And while this is a pre-recorded event, which means we won't be able to take audience questions, we really encourage you to get involved in the discussion on Twitter and in the comment section, and to share your ideas and your thoughts and your own interest in modernism. So this is a panel that really doesn't need any introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. We're joined today by Diana Suhami, who is the author of numerous biographies, including of Gluck, Radcliffe Hall, Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, the book Wild Girls, which looks at the circle of women around Natalie Barnett, and most recently, No Modernism Without Lesbians. Frances Wilson is the author of biographies of J. Bruce Ismay, Dorothy Wordsworth, Harriet Wilson, Thomas de Quincey, and her newest book, The Burning Man, examines the life and work of D.H. Lawrence. And Paul Mason is an award-winning journalist, broadcaster, and filmmaker, previously economics editor of BBC Newsnight and Channel 4 News. His books include Clear Bright Future, Post-Capitalism, Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, Live Working or Die Fighting, and Rare Earth, a Novel. And his most recent book is How to Stop Fascism, History, Ideology, and Resistance. So thank you so much for joining us. It's really great to see you here, and I'm really excited for this discussion. And I know we're going to talk about loads of really interesting aspects of modernism, how it relates to our lives today, and some of the movers and shakers in the movement. So Diana, I was really hoping to start with you and your new book, No Modernism Without Lesbians, which looks at the lives of 4 really key women in the modernist movement, and women who have tended to have been written out of literary history and their contributions kind of minimized a little bit. So we've got Sylvia Beach, who set up Shakespeare and Company. We've got Breyer, who was like a publishing force. We've got Natalie Barnett, whose studio and salon brought together loads of the leading lights of modernism. And Gertrude Stein, of course, whose incredible, visceral and forward-thinking works really kind of shaped a lot of modernist writing. Famously, she taught Hemingway how to write, although she never really got the credit she deserved for that. So I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about these 4 women and the importance that they had in the modernist movement and why you decided to focus on them in your book.
Yes, it was an extraordinary time for, I mean, they all congregated in Paris, and they went there to escape the repressions and expectations of their hometowns like London, and because there was censorship in America and in England, and I chose these four because I wanted it to be character driven. I could have chosen. There was a point when I thought, should I be calling this Lesbians Galore? Because there were so many of them, and within their lives, the lives of other women, I wanted to focus on the contribution they made, and the fact that they were lesbian was significant because they were in opposition to the patriarchy. What they felt and who they were wasn't freely allowed. And they went to Paris and could be themselves. I mean, I think Gertrude Stein said it wasn't just what Paris gave you, it was all it didn't take away. So Sylvia Beach, who founded the bookshop Shakespeare and Company and single-handedly published Ulysses in 1922, which is, considered in many ways the seminal modernist novel, where no other publisher could or would because it was censored. Which meant that no printer would print it, because with censorship, it wasn't just the author and the publisher, it was the printer, the distributor, the whole shebang. And she published that, and also Shakespeare and Company was so much more than which is still there today. She founded it in just at the end of the First World War in 1919, published Ulysses in 1922. But it was more than a bookshop. It was also a gravitational point where expatriate writers like Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald, they all flocked to Sylvia Beach. And then I chose, so she was my first one, Briar. She was born Winifred Elliman and was the daughter of the richest man in England. She called herself Briar. In today's terms, she would be called, I guess, trans, because she felt herself to be trapped in the wrong body, that transgender feeling that is unique to the trans identity, really, to feel that you're trapped in the wrong body. And she gained her inheritance by lavender cover-up marriages, and she became an extraordinary philanthropist. She set up Contact Editions, which published for the first time Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald and Gertrude Stein. And then and she was the partner of HD, and really was instrumental. She made one of the marriages she made was in order to adopt H.D. Hilda Doolittle, the poet Hilda Doolittle's daughter, Perdita, to give her a parenting, really, or official parenting. And she was just quite extraordinary in her generosity with the arts. And then I choose Natalie Barney, who wanted to make Paris the Sapphic centre of the Western world. And I chose Gertrude Stein because how could I not, really? And Gertrude had this wonderful way of putting things. She said 20th century literature is Gertrude Stein. But she also, she bought the paintings of Picasso and Matisse and Cézanne when they were unknown. She bought their paintings for very little money and forwarded their careers. And then after the First World War, she forwarded the careers of Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald and those modernist writers. So those are the four that I choose. And the underpinning idea is to show the contribution that they made, which is often written out of history because of the fact it was quite interesting that the publisher actually wanted the word lesbian in the title. Whereas when I first started writing these books, you really didn't use the word lesbian if you wanted a mainstream publisher and your mother to talk to you again, But times have changed from the 1980s when I started writing these books and now.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to talk a little bit about Sylvia Beach as well, because I think, her contribution is so important. And in the sort of, creation of Ulysses, there were so many women who were instrumental to Ulysses becoming published. And yet, again, their names have kind of been written out of history. So as well as Sylvia, we had Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role that they played and their bravery in getting published. I think there's this wonderful line that Jane Heap said when they went to court, when she was like, it was the artist who elevated love and sex to everything it is, and it is the Mr. Sumner who has made it obscene. I mean, I always adore that quote because it just tells us so much about the importance of art and writing and publishing, and the determination of these kind of very fusty old men in repressing it. So yeah, if you could sort of say something about Margaret and Jane, that would be great.
Who were lesbians as well. And they started the Little Review. And they tried publishing or did publish in serial form parts of Ulysses because they all saw that it was a groundbreaking novel. And they got done for censorship and they couldn't, their defiance was extraordinary. I mean, Margaret Anderson said when told to stand when the court came in, she said, why should she stand to these sleepy old men who wanted to, wouldn't understand a word she was saying? And in fact, the censors curiously admitted that the judge said he hadn't read the book, couldn't read it, but he was sure it was filthy. But their courage in publishing and the destruction of censorship, really, their magazine did fold because of censorship on it. But these efforts that were made, and then there was Harriet Weaver, of course, in London, who also tried to publish it in serial form, and again the same thing happened, So it was it was, I mean, it's quite interesting. I think they would have curled in their boots that it was lesbians who were intrinsic to the publication of Ulysses, which isn't a fact that's often known.
Absolutely. And yeah, Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap, such an extraordinary couple, and Margaret so polished and beautiful with her gorgeous hat wear, and Jane, I always call her the original Butch, really. Like she,
yeah, and they were quite something. I mean, there were times if they didn't think anything was good enough, they just published blank pages in the little review. You know? But again, it was Ezra Pound and the modernists that were published in their magazine, you know? And they had no money, of course.
And no one got paid.
No one got paid, no.
Some things never change in the
Nothing
publishing, shall we say. I guess as well, like, I mean, Natalie Barnett may be a new name to some of our listeners. And I guess her contribution in so many ways was not so much writing, but in bringing women together and creating this community. And like, how important was it that women writers and artists had these spaces, these salons, these communities to come to share their work and to promote one?
I think it was, that's absolutely it. And I think that, I mean, Natalie Barnett, I included her. She said that her life was her work of art, you know, and she liked epigrams and aphorisms, and she said, you know, people call it unnatural. All I can say is it's always come naturally to me. And her Friday afternoon salons were everybody flocked there, you know, and they aired the work that they were doing, and everything was bleached of shame, you know. That was what was so nice, because I mean, still today, if you think of it, in a quarter of the countries of the world, lesbians and homosexuals are criminalized. It was quite extraordinary. And you know, in 1928, when Radcliffe Hall published her anodyne novel, The Well of Loneliness, and the sexiest thing in it was that night they were not divided. And it's a boring book, really. And I think she does write, she kissed her full on the lips. That's as hot as it gets. But it was censored as obscene and burned in the king's furnace. And at Natalie's salons and with everything that she said and the life she lived, it was the opposite of that. It was everything bleached of shame. It was say what you want to say, write what you want to write, be who you want to be, which is the opposite, I guess, of what fascists would have, and censors would have us be.
And of course, the gatherings that she had, you know, everyone who was anyone was there. You'd meet Mata Hari, you'd meet Renee Vivienne, Sylvia Beach would be there, Janet Flanner, Colette would turn up in drag. I mean, these were the sort of parties of Paris. And
I think part of the real was the strawberry tarts and the little sandwiches that her maid, Berta, made for them, you know. So it was a wonderful time, I think. And Sylvia Beach said at Natalie's one met lesbians, women in high collars and monocles. I don't know whether it was, though Miss Barney herself was so feminine, she said. But you know, it was the freedom. I included her because of that wonderful thing of freedom and of the courage to speak out and say what you will.
And of course, Gertrude Stein never went to her salons because she only ever attended her own salon. But before we get to Gertrude, I wanted to turn to you, Frances, and talk a little bit about D.H. Lawrence, because I think that sort of idea of freedom and saying what wasn't being said before was so crucial to his work. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to like what brought you to Lawrence? Like what inspired you to turn to him and to write this book?
Well, I think women have always had a strong relationship to Lawrence, usually adversarial, and women of my generation particularly, because when I was at school and university, Lawrence was first being, I suppose, what we call now cancelled. You know, he was being taken off the curriculum, having in the 1960s been seen as singularly responsible for sexually liberating us in sexually liberating women in fiction. And so he's complicated. I had a row to have with him. There was always a row I wanted to have with him. And so I decided it was time to have it. And my mother wouldn't let Lawrence in. My mother didn't have any Lawrence in the house. She wouldn't allow Lawrence in the house. And my tutor at university wouldn't teach Lawrence. And so everywhere I turned, kind of Lawrence was kind of banned to me. But yet, of course, that made him all the more exciting. So I read Lawrence Under the Sheets, and I was struck by the way in which, however hard we tried to get rid of Lawrence, we could never get rid of Lawrence. We can't properly absorb him, but we also just can't get rid of him. He's still there. Even though people don't read Lawrence anymore, the name is still very, very potent and resonant. So I wonder, and women don't write about Lawrence. His biographers have all been men, except for Brenda Maddox, and the critics tend to be men, and so I thought it was time for a woman to roll up her sleeves.
I mean, even when I was a teenager, I tried to buy a copy of Sons and Lovers, and my dad wouldn't let me. He said, "Why don't you just read Enid Blyton?" So he still kind of carried that potency even in the early noughties. Wow. But I guess, what were those rows that you wanted to have with him, and how do you approach those rows in the book?
Well, the rows I wanted to have with him, I ended up really not having with him, because I thought we were going to be talking about, I thought I was going to be rowing with Lawrence about sex and female sexuality. But in fact, what he has to say about sex is of so little interest to me that it didn't come into the book at all, really. And so the center of the book just kind of fell away. And I discovered there were lots of things that Lawrence talked about that I didn't know he was interested in before, that were of huge interest to me. And I guess one of the reasons why what he said about sex became so uninteresting to me is because so much of it has been absorbed anyway into mainstream culture. The writing about women from the inside has been generally absorbed, assuming that that sexual pleasure is something that we can take for granted, has been absorbed. And writing about the body, I mean, it seems so ridiculous now to say that when you describe character, you have to describe more than the head. I mean, we do have a life in our bodies, and Lawrence took that to an extreme, in as much as he believed that, I mean, Lawrence's depiction of the body was kind of comedic in many ways. I mean, he saw the unconscious as a real organ that was positioned behind the solar plexus, and he thought that he had TB because there was too much love leaning from his heart onto his lungs. So he had a kind of crazy version of the body, but this was the crazy version of the body that a lot of New Age people in the New Age Edwardians, people think in the First World War and the Second and the 1920s did believe in. But what I found interesting about Lawrence was his very, very ambivalent relation to modernism. He had an ambivalent relationship to everything, but his relationship to modernism really was complicated. And I realized that so much of the writing, Lawrence's writing, that has been marginalized, his poetry and his travel writing should be at the center of the canon, is the best work he did. And the work that's at the center of the canon, the novels, is the worst work. And so that should be, so the canon, I think, the Lawrence canon is inside out. As far as modernism was concerned, I mean, Lawrence was a contrarian in all things. He based his philosophy was no progress without contraries, and so if you try and take the contraries away in Lawrence, you kind of you take apart his very being. But he was an anti-modernist. I mean, he was a man who looked back to the medieval age as his golden period. Dante lived in the golden age, and he inhabited his own period of the early 20th century with fantastic rage and discomfort. But he also celebrated the loosening of the poetic line. He loved free verse. He wanted poetry to be as up to the minute as possible, spinning in the sky winds. He said, let's write about now. We've got to capture what it's like to be alive and breathing now. And his view of the novel became that it should be more and more and more of an incendiary device. So he started off writing, novels like Young George Eliot, and he ended up writing novels pretty much like James Joyce. I mean, his most modernist novel, Kangaroo, was written in 1922, but at the same time, it was published in 1922, at the same time that obviously Ulysses was published, and Lawrence hadn't read Ulysses, but yet he was doing something very, very similar in Ulysses. He was playing with form in much the same way as Joyce was. So it was all, as Lawrence would say, it was all in the air. And what he meant by that was quite literally in the air.
It's so interesting. And I think it's so interesting as well what you say about the canon being the wrong way around, because I think when I was younger, that's how I first read Lawrence, was the poetry. And it is so striking how modern it is and how it kind of engages with so many issues around memory and past and psychoanalysis and things like that. I mean, we talked a little bit with Diana about the importance of Paris for the women in modernism. Like, could you talk a little about the importance of travel for Lawrence and the sort of different places that he journeyed to and his relationship with travel and place?
Well, he couldn't stop moving. I think this is the modernist metabolism, isn't it? He couldn't stop moving. And the minute that the borders opened up again after the First World War, he went straight to Italy, and Florence was his Paris, you like. And then, but Lawrence fell out very violently with places. He fell in love with places, and then he fell out with places. And so from Italy, he went whizzing round the universe and ended up in New Mexico, and then in the end died in France. And what he was looking for was time travel. He wanted to go back in time. He had a preternatural sense of place, but he also wanted to find the modernists loved primitive society. He wanted to find the most primitive society he possibly could. He wanted to get as far away as possible from electricity and from running water and from motor cars. He was appalled by the First World War, not because he was appalled by violence. He believed in violence very strongly, but he was appalled by machine guns and poison gas. He thought that the war should be kind of bows and arrows. That's how men should fight. And so he went as far around the world as he possibly could to find the most unspoiled and the most primitive society he could, and the most primitive and unspoiled way to live. And it always went wrong for him. He always ended up, when he went to Taos Pueblo in New Mexico, he discovered that Native Americans were driving motor cars, and he couldn't stand it, and smoking cigarettes, and couldn't stand it. It's not what he wanted. And so he couldn't stop time in the way that he'd hoped.
Thank you. And we'll come back to some more of Lawrence, but Paul, I wanted to bring you into the conversation. So obviously, your sort of background in modernism was your study of music. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sort of changing modes of music in the modernist period and what that was telling us about what was going on in culture at the time.
Yes, I only studied music to postgraduate level, and it's a long time ago, but it's been something that has inhabited my thinking about modernism in all the genres ever since I did study it. So I think the first interesting thing to say about there's an interesting parallel in music with visual art, and that is modernism begins at a very clear moment, and it isn't the early 1920s, it's 1908, 1909. At the very same time that Picasso is painting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, Schoenberg and his circle, the so-called Second Viennese School, are creating the first atonal music. It's also true that completely separately, you get the other precursors of modernism, which are Scriabin, who by that time was an older Russian composer, who himself began to spontaneously move his music into the atonal world. And you get the beginnings, Stravinsky's beginnings of modernism. Now, what in other words, what we're seeing is people attacking the very basis and framing of the art form that they're working in. So, artists attacking figuration, and musicians attacking tonality. So now, for those of us who studied the atonalism in music, that is the golden age of where, in many ways, you've still got this Edwardian, Jugendstil aesthetic of late Romanticism. So the music feels. Schoenberg's first atonal piece is the second violin concerto second string quartet, which has a soprano in it, and in this string quartet, it could be late Mahler, it could be early Schoenberg, which sounds like a late Mahler, but eventually it ends up with no key, and it ends up in a place where you're not really sure anymore what it is. To me, it feels very similar to Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, because that's itself is a kind of montage of two genres together. Well, the question that I always begin from is why? What was going on in people's minds that they felt they had to do that? And the quote that we have discussed many times, Sean, the famous Virginia Woolf quote, on or about December 1910, human character changed, sticks with me. No, actually, what happened in December 1910 in London was the first Cubist exhibition. Also, the Black Friday, had happened 2 weeks before in late November, where the suffragettes were all attacked by the police. And then you got the second general election, which inaugurates the welfare state. So there's a lot going on in Virginia's mind at this point, obviously. But the thing is, I think we can see a turning point that happens between 1908 and say 1912, where artists across several genres begin to abandon the very framework of representation. You could argue in literature that it had begun much earlier with the symbolist poets of the French symbolists, Rimbaud in particular. Excuse me. But I kind of rebel against the kind of, yes, there were precursors, because the break is so clear. Now, because we're talking about 1922, what happens? What's the signal thing that happens in 1922 in music? The interesting thing is, it's the point at which both Stravinsky and Schoenberg begin a search for frameworks, because tonality for Schoenberg is no longer the framework. Stravinsky adopts what we call neoclassicism. He adopts the forms of the suite, the 18th century Baroque suite, so the dance, the gavotte, whatever. Schoenberg doesn't do that. He adopts strict serialism, which is a mathematically based technique for avoiding keys altogether. It is the surefire technique of making sure your music hangs together without key. You could also say that the parallel there is, excuse me, in the parallel in visual art would be, for example, Picasso's move back towards neoclassicism himself. So he moves back to a cooler aesthetic of more clearly defined human forms. Why does this happen? I mean, obviously the war. The war is a huge psychological break, excuse me, on the development of modernism. Everything that happens after the war is a reaction to the war, you'd have to say. But why did the first thing happen remains to me, I mean, obviously Schoenberg himself said, look, what I'm doing is as big as Einstein. That in their minds, it was, we've moved to a non-relational universe. We've moved to an indeterminacy. We have a revolution in physics and science. What we're doing is a parallel to that. And so by 1922, you've had the revolutionary moment. Then you've had the war, which proves that modernity is in fact a hellscape of killing, machine level killing, dehumanization. And so in a way, I think we have to see modernism as having two birth moments, that immediate post-war period and then the previous period of its kind of naive period when people said, let's just break every rule that the academy has imposed on us.
And I want to come back to that, but the sort of ideas of breaking rules and sort of taking art forms and attacking every framing of it is so crucial to the work of Gertrude Stein. And Diana, I was wondering if you could sort of add anything from what Paul was saying in terms of Stein's work and how she kind of pulled language apart, pulled words apart. And I know there's some sort of interesting literary criticism around the fact that she was trying to create a specifically lesbian aesthetic and kind of rejecting the sort of patriarchal masculine forms of language and form, and instead making something new that was intrinsically female and lesbian.
Yes, it's interesting because of course she and Picasso were such great friends, you know, and he did that portrait of her after 90 sittings, you know, and as well as encouraging her. But she wanted to break all the rules. I think she asked those fundamental questions, you know, why should a book have chapters, and why should page 5 follow page 4? Why do we use commas the way we do? You know, she wanted to throw out all these orthodoxies, and she was influenced by William James and these ideas of the subconscious and automatic writing, and she had studied psychology, and she wanted to break with the past. And I think that key thing of modernism, that shock of the new, that, you know, why should a novel have a linear trajectory? And a lot of her work was and remains actually completely mystifying. You know, I mean, she'd write it, and then Alice B. Toklas would type it up without hesitation, and Gertrude didn't edit it, and she got loads of rejections, of course. But I don't know whether I don't think that she set off. I would be very surprised if she set off to create a lesbian canon, you know. But certainly her writing, I think there was one of her, well, it's quite esoteric, but I think she calls it As a Wife Has a Cow, a love story. She called it her Tristan and Isolde. And Steinian scholars, of which I'm not one, said that a cow, when she writes about a cow, she says, my wife having a cow is now, my wife having a cow is now my wife having a cow. That cows are orgasms, and that it takes a bit of deciphering to get there. But it does make some sort of sense that she talks about these are her love letters to her wife, as she called her, who was Alice B. Toklas. And I did write an earlier book called Gertrude and Alice, and the irony that all the stereotypical happy marriage was created by two eccentric lesbians, if you like. You know, they fell in love, they were romantic, they stayed together, and they were happy. The only thing was that it was utterly disallowed, of course, in any terms. But I think that her writing, curiously, she doesn't go away, even though not many people can claim to have read every word of Gertrude Stein. And it wasn't until she wrote a very accessible book, which was the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, a memoir, that people really, with much relief, could understand exactly what it was she was writing about. Her rejection, she had cupboards full of rejected manuscripts, but again, Contact Editions, which was funded by Breyer and founded by her lavender cover-up husband, Robert McCalman, did publish her. And she wrote this book, The Making of Americans, which is, she wanted the big global ideas. She wanted to write a book about everything and everybody. But it's, she as you can't really, you can call it, she does actually ask you, what is sense? What is a novel? What is a poem, even if you like? And if modernism was this chucking out of the old orthodoxies, she didn't have to do that.
She certainly did. Which was very funny as well. The autobiography of Alice B. Toklas is a very funny book. I mean, my favourite bit is when she talks about Pound coming to tea and him breaking a chair and him not being allowed back.
Yes, there were lots of it. I loved, what I love about Gertrude Stein is that she writes this seemingly, you could think, oh, this is utterly, what is she on about in her prose? But in her everyday manner, she was entirely down to earth and commonsensical and astute and enormously helpful to young painters, young writers, in forwarding their careers. So and very straightforward in her domestic life. I mean, she said of her own relationship, you either have to have a theory of obligation, or you go where your impulse lends you. She wanted to have a theory of obligation. That was the foundation of her marriage and of her life in many ways. I mean, she was a good woman, really, But somebody once asked her, why don't you write the way you speak? To which she replied, why don't you read the way I write? So she knew what she was doing, but she was extremely playful, yes, I think.
And Frances, what about Lawrence? I mean, how was he kind of engaged? I mean, you said he was kind of anti-modernism and outside of it, but also engaging with it. And what was he doing with form and his approach to poetry and novels that kind of made things new and broke things apart?
Well, I think the turning point for Lawrence was when The Rainbow was censored for obscenity in 1915. And The Rainbow, he saw, is essentially it's his Bible. I mean, it is a book based on the Bible. He couldn't work out why it was censored. It's still hard to understand now why it was censored, except that it was that Lawrence was a kind of an outspoken, fiery young author with a German wife. So this was it was an anti-German statement. But like as with Radcliffe Hall, the Rainbow was burnt publicly by a public hangman. And it was so appalling for Lawrence because until this moment, he hadn't been doing anything modernist with the novel at all. He'd been writing fairly conventional, kind of, as I said, kind of George Eliot, Thomas Hardy style novels. But when The Rainbow was burnt, he decided then that he was going to stand outside. He said, I'm going to stand outside the herd and throw bombs into it. And that's what he did. And at that point, his novels became incendiary devices. And he said, if you're going to censor me, then you'll censor me for a reason. So what he did and what he did with Women in Love, which was the novel he wrote after The Rainbow, and also the sequel to The Rainbow, which he introduces the characters of Ursula and Gudrun in The Rainbow, and then we follow them moving into the modern world in Women in Love. So The Rainbow is based in the 19th century. Women in Love shows these two women kind of growing out of the 19th century and into the 20th century and doing what Lawrence himself was doing, which was traveling. And he decided that what the novel needed to do was to re-understand character. He was very influenced by Freud, of course. Everyone was very influenced by Freud, but he was against Freud. He was threatened by Freud. He knew that Freud was onto something with the unconscious and with instincts and with sexuality, but he didn't want to follow Freud. He wanted to have his own theories of the unconscious. And he said, we've got to break down all the ideas of the ego. We've got to get rid of the ego and replace the ego in novels with rhythm. Characters respond to certain rhythms. And you can see that this is more or less exactly what Virginia Woolf did as well, but Virginia Woolf did it much more successfully, I think. Lawrence's rhythmic personality, rhythmic characters in Women in Love aren't, I think, hugely successful on the page. I don't think he did very good modernist novels. He knew that something had to break, but he wasn't entirely sure what it was or how to break it. Where it really worked with him was in literary criticism, when his literary criticism is really second to none, and his his finest work, I think, is in Studies in Classic American Literature, which was written during the First World War, before he'd ever been to America. And he hadn't really read much American literature, but he was basing it on the books that he had in front of him in Cornwall. And it was a book that was then 200 years ahead of its time. And I say 200 years ahead of its time because it's now 100 years later and it's still 100 years ahead of its time. I mean, what he said about the power of literature, where literature comes from, where a culture comes from all these kind of repressed instincts, was so devastatingly strong that it just leaves you gasping. And this is where Lawrence was so totally freed by his lack of university education, that he could really think independently. And you feel it in his poetry as well, that he took his poetry so unseriously. That's why it's so good and so modernist, because he wasn't trying to make a point with it. Every time he had a theory, you lose interest. And his theory of the novel makes the novels terribly hard going. But he had no theory of poetry except for the joy of writing about the now, the moment, the spinning of wheels against the sky. And he injected into his poetry the modernist wit that we find missing in the novels. The poems are like witty little jokes, witty little tricks, especially with what he was doing with nature. So he managed to blend a kind of the 19th century romantic tradition, the romantic tradition of writing lovingly about the natural world, with 20th century irony. And so I think Lawrence's strongest poems are the Birds, Beasts and Flowers. They're his poems about nature. He was very influenced by the Romantics, and precisely because the Romantics were themselves so modern, because the Romantics were themselves breaking something. They were outlaws, and he identified with that outsider position. And so you find in Lawrence all the time sort of deep readings of Shelley and Blake. He loved Whitman, because Whitman wrote brilliantly about being alive in his own body. And so Lawrence was much more interested in looking back to through literary tradition than he was in reading Eliot and reading Pound and his contemporaries, who he had nothing to say to at all, mainly because they're a complete different class, because Lawrence was working class. And the snobbery of the literary establishment he found himself catapulted into as a young man was so unbearable that he just decided that he was always going to be an outsider. So he'd look at the romantic outsiders.
I'm just wondering whether or not the theme I'm taking away from this conversation is, we started with there's no modernism without lesbians, and I think you could maybe say one of the lessons of Lawrence is there's no modernism without sex. An even deeper kind of thought might be there's no modernism without the body. And if you write the history of modernism from that point of view, rather than as a series of formal innovations, which were amazing at the time, you can locate Lawrence within it. If thinking about music, I have consistently located Delius, Frederick Delius, yes, within modernism, despite the fact that in many ways his music is it's late romantic. It's yes, late romanticism. And the reason I do it is because, above all, one work, his only successful opera, well, none of them were successful, but the one that works is Fenimore and Gerda, written in 1909, same time as a lot of these, as a lot of the work we're talking about. Why is it modern? And obviously the music is pantonal, it moves beyond tonality, but it's not atonal, it's not that revolutionary. what's revolutionary is it's the depiction of a relationship.
Mm.
It's a non-sequential, again looking at Stein, it's a series of pictures. It's a series of scenes that don't really follow each other.
Yeah.
And it's all about a male female relationship and how a modern male female relationship should or might work. It's a classic, boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy finds another girl, hence the phrase Fenimore and Goethe. But it is amazingly modern, and of course wasn't actually ever performed until in a school hall in 1967 in North London. So I'm just trying to say that there's a lot more of the writing of the history of modernism that can be done if we take these standpoints of sexuality, sex, and the body, rather than the formal innovations. It does allow you to bring in a link. And of course, it also then, I think we shouldn't leave the discussion without saying the dark side of modernism. Above all, if you then read, say, Junger, Ernst Junger's work post 1919, the human body as the machine,
Yes.
the human body as the self-victimized, willingly exploding subject of warfare, is incredibly there, and that we've got Marinetti, we've got Pound, we've got Junger. There are plenty of examples of how Nietzschean nature politics takes you down a dark route within modernism. And again, I think if the project were to rewrite the history of modernism from the point of view of sex, the body, and people, then its dark side becomes very much more explicable and not an accident, which is often seen like Junger, and Pound, look at how bad he went, and look at Marinetti. No, it's not an accident, because they're pursuing two routes: human unfreedom and human freedom, both through the prism of modernism.
Yes.
Sorry, Frances, go ahead.
I'm just going to say that Lawrence feeds into this this body as the machine theme absolutely, as you describe it. One of the things he felt most urgently about the body was that the body was itself becoming dehumanized. You had to put character back in the body. You had to get people out of uniform, stop marching. People were not weapons.
And Paul, I mean, obviously your previous book, Clear Bright Future, talks a lot about humanism and this kind of conflict between anti-humanism and the machine, and the potential for human nature and for humanity. I mean, where does modernism kind of fit into your thinking about this? You just mentioned the sort of dark side. I mean, there was this resistance of fascism in the 1920s coming from the modernist movement, but also this real engagement with fascism and this machine body and this kind of violence and around it. So could you speak more to that?
I would say modernism fascism rejected modernism. Modernism did not reject fascism, in the sense that, it tried quite a long time to adapt itself to Italian fascism, which had a lot of tropes and memes of technological modernity involved in it. Nazism could never absorb it. Neither could Phalangism in Spain, nor could the Catholic fascism of the Austrians. So I think it's not so. I mean, look, modernism and fascism were both products of a particular breakdown process in the 20th century, and I think that one process produces a real amazing leap into the world of freedom, of freedom of thought and of freedom of creation. Like, we're talking about, people who decided, no more chapter orders, or people who decided no more prurience about sex, or people who simply decided, we've had 1,000 years of tonality, let's not have it anymore. But in the end, for me, I'm just interested in the materialist account of why things happen. We can't. What frustrates me about the study of modernism is even now, decades after its end, the ability of academia to study it as if all the surrounding things, from the motor car to the aeroplane to quantum physics, were in some way sort of circumstantial evidence, and that modernism is the thing. Whereas, I think we have to see modernism as part of the circumstance of all these intellectual upheavals that take place between about 1908 and about 1923.
Absolutely. And just one of my favourite quotes in the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas is when the futurists come to tea and Gertrude says, and everyone agreed the futurists were very dull. So I've just got one final question for you in the last 5 minutes, which is the kind of bonus question that I always like to ask. But we're talking about 1922, we're talking about 100 years since this kind of modernist moment. 1922 was The Wasteland, it was Ulysses, it was Jacob's Dream by Virginia Woolf. All of these movements were coming together, these conversations were happening. So if you had to recommend one kind of key modernist work that you love or enjoy or you think is crucial to this moment, what would you recommend? And Diana, let's go to you first.
I think what I'd like is Gertrude's Four Saints in Three Acts, which was her libretto. The music was by Virgil Thomas. It was put on in America. I think it was later. It was 1934, I think. You know, when Hitler was Chancellor and Führer too at that time, and it was an all-black cast, and it was. I think it was Frederick Ashton who did the choreography, and it was just a complete wow. And it was, you know, they were African American. The cast was African. It was Gertrude's immortal prose. You know, pigeons on the grass, alas, pigeons on the grass, alas. And I think there was 4 scene twos and things. And it was just the wonderful exuberance of the new. I'd love to see it on at the Coliseum in London or the Theatre Royal in Glasgow again, with an all-black cast and with a gay director as well. So it was this breaking down of the old barriers, of the old formulae, and I think that really did encapsulate it.
I'm really glad you brought that up as well, because I think it's, again, like, people don't expect Gertrude Stein to be writing operas, and it's sort of a forgotten aspect of her work, and yet it was really revolutionary and really important.
It was revolutionary, it really was, and it was so antipathetic to I mean, fascism was then creeping like a snake into the whole of our history, you know.
I will just jump in with my offer, which is another 1922 creation, which is Wozzeck by Alban Berg. It is the first successful atonal opera. It's about the brutality of militarism. So 1922, you've got this, I mean, it's probably not his greatest work. I think Lulu is his greatest work, and something is certainly his orchestral music. But I think if people are looking for a jump off into what was different, and this fusion between formalistic innovation in music and also in drama, because, you know, it's a spiky story, and the theme of dehumanization in war, that's the work.
And Frances, what would yours be?
It's another 1922 product, and it's what I mentioned before, Kangaroo, Lawrence's novel Kangaroo, which I think is one of his best novels. It was written in during his visit to Australia. He was only in Australia for 100 days, and during that time he wrote the great Australian novel. And Kangaroo himself, the character Kangaroo, is a fascist leader, and so he reflects while he's in Australia on the fascism that he'd seen in Italy.
Yeah.
In Florence the previous year, and he uses all the modernist devices, like a little set of fireworks in this novel, in a way that he's never done before, but with complete joy. And so in the same way as Joyce, he uses kind of newspaper headlines. Sometimes he just quotes the newspaper as he's reading it. He writes himself in as a character. He puts his he records dialogue between himself and Frida, his wife, you know, which he sends himself up, and he remembers the First World War. In one chapter is just entirely about going back to Cornwall. Another chapter is projecting into the future, and it's a novel about the process of writing a novel. And he wrote it in a very sort of light, light-hearted way because he felt at peace in Australia, but it's got a very, very dark theme because it's about burgeoning fascism. And I think it's Lawrence that is most interesting, and it's the Lawrence that we don't know. No second.
Good. Because I mean, I think that's the thing with Lawrence, isn't it? There's a lot of Lawrence that we don't know. Everybody goes back to
almost all of Lawrence we don't know. We know
that's true.
2 novels or something. We don't know him at all. That's what I discovered.
And I guess we're having this conversation, 1922, 2022, and we're in our own situation of creeping fascism and war and conflict. And so many of the themes that we've discussed are still feeling very present and very real in a way that perhaps we hoped they wouldn't be. But that's why I'm so glad we could have this conversation. And so yes, thank you so much, Frances Wilson, Diana Suhami and Paul Mason. If you'd like to buy copies of the book, we have partners with Waterstones, so please just click the link. And as I say, please do sign up to the Bristol Ideas Festival newsletter and social media accounts so that you can come to more events like this. But yes, once again, as we don't have a crowd in a room, I'm just going to do it here, but thank you very, very much.
Thank you.